Brampton Plantation right now. We're doing a project, data recovery action, in reference to the Brampton Road Connector Project, which Georgia Department of Transportation is the applicant for.
Some people might be surprised to know that GDOT has a cultural resource section with professional archaeologists and historians. Our main goal is to try to find a balance between protecting these resources that we value so much and also helping the roadway projects to go through the state. For each project, we have to identify significant cultural resources, both historic and archaeological. And those are resources that we consider to be eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places or those that are already listed. We do all of this work in conjunction with multiple groups. The lead federal agency, which for Brampton is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
As a federal agency, the Army Corps of Engineers is tasked with fulfilling what's called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. National Historic Preservation Act tasks the lead federal agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, with considering their impacts to historic properties. So we went through the identification effort to identify whether or not historic properties were present here. We found the historic properties were present. We were tasked with evaluating their significance. We found them to be highly significant, and we had to apply what's called the criteria of adverse effects to the sites. And we found that our action, this Brampton Connector Project, would lead to an adverse effect. So to mitigate for those adverse effects, we've developed a set of stipulations with the Army Corps of Engineers, our applicants, Georgia Department of Transportation, our state interests, State Historic Preservation Office. We've also been working with some local community partners as well, in addition to the Gullah Geechee Heritage Commission. So all those minds kind of came to the table and thought through what would be adequate means to resolve adverse effects to these historic resources.
In order to identify those significant resources, we have to do a survey of the project area, which entails field work, and then we do a report of findings to document whether we found resources and whether those resources were significant. And this work is done sometimes by staff like myself at GDOT and other times by our counterparts, the consultant counterparts that we work with, as was the case for Brampton.
There will be an elevated road, and usually with elevated roads, that leads to less of an impact to historic properties. But unfortunately, yes, there will be an impact to the historic property.
Sometimes we're not able to avoid a total adverse effect, and in those cases we have to do what we call mitigation to sort of offset that effect in some way. And often for archaeological sites, that's archaeological data recovery, which we're doing here, and that's the excavation of large units in the impacted area to try to save as much data as we can for posterity and for future researchers.
The location that is looking right now that will be related to the impacts is looking like some of the ditch features related to the rice plantation.
There are many, many different iterations of archaeological and historic resource surveys for this project, and they spanned all the way from 2010 until 2020. And the reason we needed to do all these surveys was to try to find what we call the least damaging alternative for design, which is the design that hopefully impacts cultural resources and other resources like ecological resources the least.
We're conducting archaeological excavations on the former elements of an inland tidal rice field that was active during the 19th century. Previous studies of Brampton Plantation involved with the road project, Georgia Department of Transportation's needs, and the railroad here that services the port have identified elements of the former rice fields at Brampton. And so our current data recovery investigations are targeting the leftover remnants of the rice agriculture. The Brampton Plantation rice fields were quite expansive. They expand outside of our area of investigation and the area of impact for the new road project. However, the majority of the area that we are allowed to study and that we're looking at is within Brampton Plantation.
The
Plantation was begun by Jonathan Bryan, a Revolutionary War hero, in 1765. Bryan was already a very established planter in South Carolina, having numerous self-sufficient plantations all up and down the Savannah River, and he came to Brampton to retire. He had modest holdings, around 400 acres, centered here on the bluff, overlooking the Dundee Canal.
We don't really see evidence of rice until the Williamson family comes into ownership of Brampton in the early 19th century. We have an 1816 plat that demonstrates the beginnings of the system that we're actually doing archaeology on.
The Williamson family increased rice production within the floodplain here at the canal dramatically from Bryan's time. I think in 1845 they were doing over 50,000 pounds of rice yearly.
This is an opportunity where the scientists, i.e. the archaeologists and historians, can work in the same space as a lot of our community interests, specifically a lot of the tradition keepers relating to Gullah Geechee culture, African American culture. You know, how do we ensure that those tradition keepers are provided a seat at the table sitting directly across from the archaeologists? And the archaeologists providing information, the tradition keepers, the descendant communities providing information, so we can get a more holistic understanding of who the individuals were that called Brampton Plantation home. Individuals that spent time at Brampton Plantation will go on to lead ministries all throughout the world. So it made sense to get community buy-in for action such as this.
Brampton is a site that is international in focus. The story begins here in Chatham County, but it then reaches around the entire world, going to Canada with David George, going to Jamaica, going to the Bahamas with Father George Loud. But then the powerful one that remains right here in the United States, keeping it all together, Father Andrew Bryan. Father Bryan began to realize that we can no longer be tied to Brampton, that we need to move into the outskirts of the city of Savannah. And so he moves to a place called Yamacraw, where they begin to acquire property in Yamacraw, from Mill Street to later on what we know as Bryan Street, and purchasing the property that will be right there in Yamacraw in the 1790s. For $150, that's what will occur in Yamacraw, the site that is now historic First Bryan Baptist Church. And what then later on happened? Later on we see the third pastor, which is his nephew, Father Andrew Cox Marshall, who will now manage the church site right there in Yamacraw, but then they begin to expand to the site where we are right now, 1832. So Father Bryan is essential to us with regards to telling the story of African people, with regards to spirituality and also leadership. Because when we look at Father Andrew Bryan, he's one of the first black leaders in all of North America. Not just Savannah, not just in Georgia, not in this new nation known as the United States, but in all of North America.
Understanding who was out there building it and why it was built as our first steps to a greater understanding of the period, prior to the Civil War.
We understand that one of the first cash crops in this area is rice. And so you have Africans now being brought over here who understand about the production of rice, because they're producing rice in Africa that is the African rice and the Asian rice in Africa. So when they come across the water, they come to the knowledge of God with them and the knowledge of the Trinity with them. Now, many people, when they hear Trinity, they think about Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I said, no, it's cotton, rice, and indigo.
Individuals were being taken from the coast of West Africa. They were being taken for specific reasons. Those specific reasons we're actually looking at them. We're actually able to see them through the archaeology. You know, these individuals were coming with a high intellect into rice production and what that took, you know, and how to manipulate the land for that specific thing.
Brampton being a rice plantation, it is basically a manifestation of the genius in Africa that they now bring over here and they now lay it out when they begin the production of rice. They understand.
Today we're standing at the main canal. There would have been a massive support structure that prevented the heavy tidal water of the Savannah River from entering the plantation when the people didn't want it to be in there. That gate would have also allowed fresh water in. Salt water and fresh water sit together as wedges. And so as the tide comes in, it pushes the fresh water up as salt water pushes up. And then when the tide comes out, salt water leaves and all that's left is the fresh water draining down the river from the uplands. Even though the historic context of the canal has changed due to the modern industry and manipulations of the 20th and 21st centuries, it still retains its original shape, and it carries on for several hundred feet through the middle of the rice fields. The water went through the canal and then filtered through a series of embankments and ditches and other canals in order to flood and drain the rice fields as needed. What we see are large embankments built of earth and clay. Some of them have ditches along their side, some have ditches on both sides, and some support larger canals. They vary in size, in width, in dimension, in height, and in internal construction. So this embankment clearly demonstrates the level of technology and expertise the enslaved Africans applied to the construction of these features. This embankment also is a really great example of why these features last for up to 200 years or longer. There's a modeled clay and earthen top. There's a brown gray layer of clay that creates a cap, this rounded cap to the embankment. Below that is a really thick sticky wedge of a yellow-gray clay. This is what we would call the core of the embankment. The likelihood of this ever going away from natural forces like floods, rain, or other kinds of disruption are really slim to none. This gray thin band here underneath the yellow clay is probably the old ground surface. And then below it is another wedge of clay parent to the material here. Clay would have been a repellent to water. So the more clay that's in an embankment, the less likely it is for water to push it aside, make it erode. And then this stuff on the top has some clay mixed in. So this represents the yearly rebuilding, repairing, and sort of refabrication of this feature to keep it at the same elevation and to continue to make sure that water isn't going to be coming in and either cresting the embankment or destroying it altogether. Because the Brampton features are still in the landscape, and because they still line up with a map from the 1890s, we strongly suspected that clay was used in the construction of them since they're in such great shape.
We're just taking the mudsel of the soil, so the soil color and texture. So we'll put the dirt on the back of this page right here, and we try to match it with these colors.
And so they understand what can be done to basically thwart water from coming in. Because again, we don't need salt water coming in, we need fresh water coming in. We need to be able to move the water. We need to also know how to make sure the tides are working with us. Genius. And so that's all a part of the production of rice here in coastal Georgia. In December 1864, what happened? The Big Shoot is here. In Gullah, which is the language of the people that's spoken here, Big Shoot means the Civil War.
After the Battle of Monteith, just north of where we're standing now, the Federal Army continued its march to the sea to Savannah. The Confederates had completed their defenses of Savannah by fall of 1864 and were relatively ready for the onslaught, though there were only about 10,000 soldiers manning the entire city.
So you begin to see embankments not being created by Confederates and basically by the labor of Africans to try to thwart the efforts of the Union forces coming through here and basically capturing what we know as this prize jewel called Savannah or Chatham County.
Once the 20th Corps arrived here, they set up on this side of the Dundee Canal, facing Confederate forces across the way. The siege lasted a number of nights, resulting in the construction of lots of earthworks in the area, as well as the deposition of battle-related materials, which we identified during survey of the Brampton Road Connector project. Finding intact military remains in this area for this project was very significant and opens up many avenues of investigation for the future.
One of the defensive elements the Confederates employed here was an overflowing of the rice fields. So they allowed more water to come into the main gate off the Savannah River than really ever before that's ever needed in order to make rice grow.
That action, if it included salt water, which it likely did, likely destroyed the rice fields and made them, rendered them useless after the battle.
Even though they began to see the destruction of, say, rice plantations along the Savannah River, cotton plantations along the Savannah River, something else is now embedded in their minds. Liberty, as some of them are going to say, liberty. They're not beginning to understand that the war is not just about them having freedom, but it's about them not having some autonomy.
Since the Civil War impacted this place, even at a low degree, the likelihood that there was anyone after the Civil War and the emancipation of all enslaved Africans, there wasn't anyone really to grow rice. There weren't any people left to control the flooding and draining process, which was a pretty intense science and technology. So that's pretty much the cap. Rice only grew with the assistance of enslaved Africans. The soils are mucky, it's very muddy, and draft animals don't work very easily in rice fields. There were attempts to try to get draft animals in, to up the scale and the amounts of rice grown, to maybe lessen the needs for human labor. It never really took off. And so once slavery was terminated in Georgia, rice was pretty much terminated, unless freed people were still around to continue the same kinds of technology from the 19th century.
You have people who are still growing rice right now in this area. That was something that just popped up, say, 10 years ago. In their families, they have been growing rice. So again, you have remnants of some of them who still remember the production of rice, how to grow rice. And even with some of them, they know how to grow rice even in the city without having the waterways. So yes, rice has always been a part of who we are.
Development of these rice features took a high set of engineering acuity, engineering understanding of the landscape in a way that I don't know has necessarily in Georgia been communicated to the greater community.
GDOT has the potential to affect many different cultural resources. And we know as professional cultural resource specialists, as well as our counterparts in the consultant world, we encounter interesting and significant resources to Georgia history all the time during our surveys for projects. So we feel it's very important as cultural resource specialists to protect these resources when we can. And if we can't do that in full, to be able to produce meaningful mitigation that helps the community that's being impacted by the project.
Archaeological excavations at Brampton Plantation's rice fields documented a complex rice landscape that employed both tidal and inland swamp rice agriculture features. These rice fields demonstrated a high degree of engineering knowledge and skill. Soil samples from the field revealed that in addition to growing rice, the embankment supported medicinal plants as well as food plants including grapes. This suggests that the African American workers grew these plants as supplements to their diets. Notably, an area referred to as the Light Swamp on historic maps was shown to have grown both rice and wheat. The use of a location to grow more than one crop was an agricultural practice in West Africa. This suggests that the Light Swamp may have been cultivated by Brampton's workforce for their own production and use. The results of this work were documented in a detailed report that will aid in the understanding of rice agriculture in Georgia and the role of West Africans in the production of this crop and these landscapes.
You got to know the hollow, there ain't no time, hollow, there ain't no water, hollow, for the fire next time, hollow, now before it's time, another year, I might be gone, in some lonesome graveyard, oh Lord, hollow, when he's born, hollow, won't be long, hollow, look for me, hollow, and I'll be gone, hollow, I'll be gone.